Until now, the dominant cartel, the Sinaloa, has been a corporate entity. They think of drug running as a business and violence as a means to an end, not an end. Jalisco New Generation is the opposite. It's a gang that just happens to run drugs. And if they cross into the United States, they will go on a violent spree that will force the Americans to revisit all things Mexico and drugs and trade. And this is now our largest trading partner. This is our single biggest partner in the world to come. And the supply chains that we're reshoring, almost all of them that matter have a big Mexican component. And so if you interlace the drug war into that's a huge problem. It's not guaranteed. AMLO will be gone in a year and a half. And
well, we think term limits can sometimes be...
Well, he tried to amend the Constitution already and failed. So he personally will no longer be the president. Doesn't mean that he can't undo some of the democratic reforms that we've seen in the last 30 years. So the risk is there, but the risk of him being the big guy is not. And there's nothing to say that Jalisco New Generation might disintegrate, because the drug cartels in Mexico tend to do that from time to time. But that is the biggest risk, in my opinion, to the American way of life and the American economy. And
we have to end with demographics because it's so important to a lot of the work you do. The trends tend to play out over decades, so people can ignore them or not appreciate them as much. But are there implications in the shorter term when it comes to demographics that we need to be paying attention to?
Sure. So the issue is, as your population ages, it depends on where the bulge in your structure is. So if your bulge is for people 45 and under, you tend to be a consumption-led society, very high growth, very high inflation. If your bulge is people roughly 40 to 65, you're a technocracy because you have older people, not a lot of consumption, but a huge amount of capital. That's where a lot of the advanced world has been for the last 20 years. And so that's one of the reasons why capital has been so cheap. It hasn't just been monetary policy. It's been that the baby boomers have been at the capital-rich point of the world. Well, in the fourth quarter of last year, the majority of the world's baby boomers had aged into mass retirement, which meant that they were liquidating all of their savings because they can't have a very forward-looking portfolio when you're in retirement, because if there's a market crash, you lose everything and you no longer have the income to recover. So capital costs are going up, and they will continue to go up for the next decade, independent of what happens with the economic cycle or the Fed. That is now baked into the cake. We have passed the Rubicon, and we are never going back to the financial environment that we've seen in the last several years. In fact, we shouldn't expect capital costs to start coming down appreciably until the millennials are in their 50s. That's not until the mid-2030s. So everything that we have to deal with now, starting now, we have to do so with less capital. And that is going to radically slow the rate of economic growth. Now, if you have capital in this environment, and I'm looking at you, Gen X, out there, because all Gen Xers are in their 50s now, and assuming you can keep it away from the tax man, big detail, the rate of return you're going to get is going to be significant because we just don't have a world awash in free money anymore. But there's not enough capital for what needs to be done. So there's pros and cons based on who you are and what you need.
Yeah, you mentioned tax rates, if you can avoid taxes, which is a big if. It sounds like you think those are all going up.
Well, the baby boomers have built into the system a very robust, very generous, very expensive set of benefits for themselves. And because life expectancy in the United States is in excess of 70, they are going to be able to vote to preserve those for a significant amount of time. And the millennials, the second generation, biggest generation we've ever had, does not want the baby boomers to move in with them. From their point of view, living with their parents was a one-way experience. So you've got the two biggest generations in American history voting for a very robust benefits program that all has to be paid for by Gen X. And there's not enough of them. So in any ballot box competition, Gen X will lose. So it'll be a fight for Gen X to benefit from their financial position.
Peter, a lot to think about once again, as always, when we catch up with you. Thank you so much for that.
Not a problem.
On the right, you've got a population center. You can see it lines up with the green. So the Russian way of dealing with this isn't great. You can't even build a road network through this territory. The economic activity per acre is so low. It's rail or nothing. So What they try to do is expand past the green through the beige to get to these geopolitical barriers, mountains, deserts, seas, and then forward position static military forces in the access points between. When the Soviet system existed, they controlled every single one of those access points. When the Soviet system fell, the Russians went from controlling all of them to one. Everything that Putin has done since has been about getting a military footprint in each and every one of those zones. This is Nagorno-Karabakh, this is the Crimea War, this is the Georgian War, this is the Kazakh intervention. They now have footprints in 5. Unfortunately for Ukraine, it's not that Ukraine is in an access point, but it's on the way to 2 of them. So the Russian goal here has always been not just to conquer all of Ukraine, but then to use Ukraine as a military launch pad to those 2 next sections. And those next sections include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and Romania, NATO allies all. This is how the Russians see the world. They see this as a fight for their existential survival, and they are not wrong. Just the scale of what the Russians feel they need to do to survive is mammoth. It's something we just have a hard time processing as Westerners. So let's talk about where we are right now. Now, the war obviously started with this massive thunder run to Kiev when the Russians tried to believe their own propaganda that the Ukrainians were going to welcome them in. And when it didn't work, when on the 3rd day of the war, that 40-mile-long train of equipment stalled on the road to Kiev, different countries drew different conclusions. In the United States, we're like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a modern war. We can totally kick their ass in a conflict. And then all the generals and the admirals had a nap and some bourbon and really thought about it, like, holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a war. We could totally kick their ass. But they see this as a war for their existential survival, which means that every tool is on the table. And if we get to the point where the Russians can overwhelm Ukraine and then come for NATO, we know we will have to fight them. And we know we will beat them on the conventional battlefield easily. And we know they will use nukes. So we can't let that happen. So every piece of equipment that we can train the Ukrainians on, they get as soon as we can possibly get it to them. That was our lesson. The Russian lesson was that, okay, our propaganda was wrong. They're not going to welcome us in. And that means the Ukrainians themselves are a problem. And so we're going to fight the war we know how to fight with artillery. And we're going to advance slowly through eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. And we are going to specifically target every piece of civilian infrastructure we see, especially agricultural infrastructure. Because if we destroy the capacity of this territory to support a population, it will self-separate into 2 groups. One group will become refugees. They will leave. We will never have to worry about them again. Anyone who stays is clearly a fighter, and they can be shot on sight. So slow artillery advance, you bring in the Wagner mercenaries to kill anyone who's left. We don't know exactly how many people are dead in Ukraine right now. It's probably about 500,000. We now believe that at least another 500,000 has been forcibly taken from the occupied territories and redistributed into Siberian territories.